In a medical emergency, time is everything. A few minutes without oxygen can cause brain damage. A few hours without surgery can turn a survivable condition into a fatal one. In medicine, time saves lives. But for millions of people in rural Indonesia, time runs out long before that life-saving help arrives. On Sapuka Island, a small cluster of land scattered across the Makassar Strait, a 36-year-old man learned this lesson in the hardest way possible. When his medical condition suddenly worsened, help was not around the corner or down the road. The only path to proper medical treatment lay across miles of open water. So he was placed on a boat that headed towards the nearest city with the facilities capable of treating him. But the distance was measured in hours, hours of waiting, hours his body simply did not have. And somewhere along that journey, before the shoreline of the city ever came into view, he died. Now, consider a very different emergency. One morning, in my own home, my mother collapsed from a ruptured appendix. Within 5 minutes, we were in the car. Within 15, approaching the nearest hospital. And 20 minutes later, she was under the care of surgeons. The appendix was removed, the infection was contained, and within days, she was recovering with minimal complications. Today, she is thankfully alive and well. Both situations required urgent medical care. Yet, the path to that care looked completely different. My mother reached a hospital in 20 minutes. The man in Sapuka Island never made it there at all. When I first learned about that story, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if our circumstances had been reversed. Because the difference between those outcomes was not medical expertise or the seriousness of the emergency, it was simply where they lived. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kayla Catherine Boy, and the problem I will be addressing today is the unequal access to healthcare in Indonesia. This speech argues that the unequal access to healthcare in Indonesia is driven primarily by two structural barriers. One, geographical, and two, socioeconomic. First, I will look into the sheer scope of healthcare disparity across the country. Then I'll explore how these geographical and socioeconomic barriers make medical emergencies far more dangerous in remote communities. And finally, I will raise a realistic improvement that could help close this gap. Now, to understand the scale of this problem, we first need to examine how healthcare resources are distributed across the country. Indonesia, my home, is an archipelago of more than 17,000 islands, environments that range from dense cities to isolated villages reachable only by boat. Delivering healthcare across this geography is undeniably complex. Yet, complexity alone does not explain the level of disparity that exists today. One statistic captures the scale of this issue almost immediately. According to a report by the Jakarta Post, the standard ratio of puskesmas, small community health centers, is one puskesmas for every 100,000 people. 100,000 people is very difficult to visualize, and understandably so. Imagine every seat in a massive stadium the size of the Super Bowl completely filled. Now imagine that entire crowd depending on a single neighborhood clinic for healthcare. That illustrates the core systemic issue of Indonesia's healthcare inequality, where the availability of medical healthcare depends heavily on how close you live to that singular facility. And even then, distance is only one part of the challenge. Across many remote regions of Indonesia, puskesmas operate with too few doctors, too few nurses, and far too little medicine. The healthcare facility itself simply being present is not enough, not when limited funding and shortages of equipment and staff mean that the level of help remains constrained. There have been villages where children have died from diseases like measles, severe malnutrition, parasitic worm infections. These are illnesses that shall rarely be fatal with modern medicine today. We live in the 21st century, a time when scientists can splice genetic material down to a cellular level and experiment with cloning. So how is it possible that children in these villages still struggle to access something as simple as a course of antibiotics? The answer is not a lack of medical knowledge. Indonesia clearly has that capability. In large cities such as Jakarta and Surabaya, hospitals are equipped with advanced technology and highly trained specialists. The difference lies in how developmental and healthcare resources are distributed across the country. Government investment in healthcare has historically and infamously been concentrated in urban centers where population density and economic activity are already at their strongest. Remote regions receive far fewer of those investments. Clinics may exist, yes, but they often rely on limited staffing programs and smaller budgets, which makes it far harder to attract trained medical professionals. Over time, this creates a structural imbalance. Cities continue strengthening their healthcare systems, while rural facilities struggle to provide even the most basic care. Ladies and gentlemen, the consequences of that imbalance are very much visible. A survey published by the Tempo magazine reported that between 2013 and 2017, 2,393 patients died at a single public hospital in Papua due to the limited number of trained medical personnel. In short, people in overlooked rural communities are trapped. The medicine exists, the vaccines exist, the doctors that could help them exist. The means to save their lives, to save their family members' lives, hangs there, just beyond their reach. A lifeline suspended above thousands of desperately grasping hands. And when confronted with a reality like that, we need to ask ourselves, what can actually be done to close this gap? What changes could begin to bring that lifeline closer to the communities that need it most? If distance is the main barrier to survival, then the solution is simple. Reduce the time it takes for patients to receive emergency care by bringing medical facilities directly to the communities that need them. The purpose of these medical centers, first and foremost, would be immediate stabilization, treating urgent conditions long enough for patients to be transferred to larger hospitals when necessary. Maintaining high standards of quality is the key feature of this solution. Indonesia, as I mentioned previously, already has the Puskesmas system, but in many regions, those facilities struggle with shortages of equipment and limited resources. The goal here is different. Emergency-focused centers that are properly staffed, well-equipped, and supported through consistent government funding and oversight. You might think this sounds unrealistic, but the medical technology required to stabilize patients, oxygen therapy, trauma care, and infection treatment already exists within Indonesia's healthcare system. The challenge then is not innovation, not a new invention, but distribution, ensuring that these capabilities reach the communities that currently lack them. Crucially, reducing that gap in time could mean the difference between a patient arriving at a hospital alive or never arriving at all. Today, we have seen that unequal access to healthcare in Indonesia is shaped by two major barriers. The first major barrier being geographical and the second being socioeconomic, together revealing the stark disparity between urban and rural healthcare. Whether someone lives or dies should never depend on where they live, and I don't think that's too unreasonable of a thing to ask. As we leave today, remember that people like that man from Sapuka Island are still out there across Indonesia, living in communities where help is hours away, waiting for systems to improve and for access to care that others take for granted. In emergencies, time is everything. If we recognize the urgency of this problem, then we cannot afford to keep them waiting any longer. Thank you for listening.